The story begins with Alan promising his newborn child a perfect life, declaring that wealth provides absolute freedom and endless opportunities. He eagerly offers to sing or dance to entertain the infant, hoping to show how success does not rely on simple luck. Meanwhile, Brian lectures his own baby about the necessity of education. He explains that a prestigious university requires a prominent grammar school, which ultimately demands attendance at a truly exceptional preschool. Soon after, Alan proudly celebrates an early victory with his wife Lauren. In another room, Brian awkwardly tries to quiet his crying baby, while his exhausted wife Sarah suggests they finally go to sleep. Brian confidently assures her that he will handle all the responsibilities. As the months pass, Brian aggressively plays with his growing boy, while Alan stays up until midnight teaching his daughter to walk. Later, Brian complains that a simple television show is ruining his son, believing that the boy should be focusing on much smarter activities. Sarah enthusiastically tests the young boy by making him name countries, and Brian soon insists they need to investigate elite educational facilities. The next morning, Brian and Sarah arrive at a prestigious academy, taking a moment to calm their nerves before entering the building. Brian bravely declares that they will not let wealthy parents intimidate them, confident that they absolutely belong at this highly exclusive institution. However, Brian is shocked to see a child checking the stock market, just as Lauren points out the familiar atmosphere of the elite school. The two couples unexpectedly cross paths inside the main hallway. Sylvia Lawrence introduces herself as the strict director of admissions. She politely explains that she must combine their introductory tours today. Sylvia introduces Brian and Sarah Young to Alan and Lauren Williams. She welcomes the ambitious parents to Pugsley's Academy of Excellence. Sylvia promises to teach Dylan and Grace how to capitalize on strengths. She proudly notes that the elite preschool operates on a full-day schedule. Sylvia mentions that weekend workshops cover complex subjects like Anglo-Saxon poetry, and emphasizes that the academy only accepts the absolute best students. She then invites both couples into her private office to talk, explaining that the school has a severely limited number of available spaces. She adds that remaining slots are fiercely contested by new children. Sylvia reveals there is only one open slot left for the year, which means the two couples must directly compete against each other. To help make her final decision, she demands a 20-page thesis detailing their child's achievements by Wednesday, along with a mandatory presentation given by the fathers later that Friday. The stunned parents silently absorb the pressure as Sylvia starts the tour, showing off the serene meditation areas designed for the toddlers. Next, she leads them into the school's impressive conservatoire, where the parents eagerly brag about their children playing piano and violin. Trying to maintain her professional demeanor, Sylvia quickly moves the group past the currently closed science lab. Feigning the need for a lavatory break, Brian sneaks away upstairs, deliberately seeking out the off-limits science room to investigate the projects. He curiously examines an advanced bioreactor known as the Plastic Eater, but he accidentally triggers a disastrous reaction, sending him into a panic. Desperate to fix his mistake, he messes with a nearby volcano project. Meanwhile, Sylvia proudly showcases the extensive foreign language department to the others, but her pitch is abruptly interrupted by an urgent phone call. She is informed about the catastrophic mess suddenly created in the lab, forcing her to immediately cut the preschool tour completely short. The parents furiously kiss up to Sylvia as she dismisses them, awkwardly filtering out of the prestigious building together. Outside, Alan decides to directly address the competitive elephant in the room. Hoping to maintain peace, he invites Brian and Sarah to dinner. Brian quickly agrees to arrive at their home by 7 that evening, which heavily confuses Sarah since they have a massive thesis to write. Walking away, Brian reveals his intention is to scope out the competition. Simultaneously, Lauren praises Alan for successfully manipulating their new rivals into relaxing. Alan smugly quotes military strategy to emphasize his cutthroat mindset. Later, Brian's father expresses pure disbelief over the massive tuition costs. He insists that ordinary daycares are perfectly fine for a young child, prompting a bitter argument about how Brian lacked similar educational privileges. Brian angrily accuses his father of prioritizing a truck over his future, mocking the old man for wasting money on ridiculous Sasquatch conventions instead. The tense family squabble is suddenly interrupted when Jeff loudly enters, casually dropping off a gift before complaining about the smelly fridge. Later that day, Jeff shows off extremely expensive designer clothes, explaining he pulled strings to acquire them for young Dylan. Brian's father brutally mocks Jeff about his terrible childhood haircut, prompting Jeff to abruptly leave for a hot yoga retreat. Meanwhile, Sarah expresses deep doubts about the overly strict preschool. She tries on an outfit meant to look incredibly intimidating, hoping to make Alan nervous enough to reveal his strategy. However, Brian immediately dismisses Sarah's bold look as totally clown-like. Sarah remains entirely convinced that Alan has a secret strategy. That evening, Brian and Sarah finally arrive at Alan's estate. Brian realizes the mansion perfectly matches his absolute dream poster. He then spots a highly disturbing giant gnome holding a baby. Lauren warmly welcomes the nervous couple into the massive home. She kindly offers her anxious guests a glass of fine wine, asking her maid Rose to grab a very special bottle.
Custard tarts. I made them this afternoon.
Thanks.
Dinner continues as Alan discusses his upcoming restaurant opening, explaining that he hopes to finalize the printed menus tomorrow. Lauren enthusiastically supports his ambitious culinary vision with promotional plans. She mentions pulling in big food critics for the event. The conversation shifts when Alan mentions a local radio station, and Brian proudly reveals it actually belongs to his brother. Changing the subject, Brian admires a model sailboat displayed nearby. Alan laments that he sold his real yacht years ago. He confesses that he misses the thrill of ocean sailing. Seizing an opportunity, Brian brags about being an avid sailor. He recklessly invites Alan out on his brother's boat tomorrow. Alan excitedly calls his assistant to completely clear his schedule. He confirms he is now free to join the excursion. The wives exchange polite farewells as the pleasant evening concludes. Lauren points out that her ancestors owned this historic land. She proudly shows off a rare statue sculpted by Michelangelo. Lauren explains that the art symbolizes her family's everlasting commitment. She casually reveals that Alan works for her wealthy father. Brian eagerly absorbs this massive revelation as they say goodbye. Walking outside, Brian smugly gloats about Alan marrying into money. Sarah nervously reminds Brian that he barely knows how to sail. She snatches the car keys because Brian is clearly intoxicated. Sarah insists that Alan will be driving the borrowed boat. Back inside the luxurious manor, the hosts discuss the evening. Alan admits he wishes Lauren had kept her fortune secret. The next day, Sarah questions a very strange new expense. Brian has hired a professional screenwriter for their preschool application. He believes this expert will make young Dylan sound incredible. An eager Brian rushes to answer the ringing front door. He greets Chase Stevens and awkwardly praises the writer's movies. Chase smugly accepts the cash payment for this bizarre job.
Let's do it now. In a world where mediocrity is...
Brian and Sarah review a boastful application video for Dylan, hoping to secure his spot at the elite academy. They tearfully admire the highly exaggerated presentation. Sarah carefully reads aloud from a glowing recommendation letters. Moments later, the front doorbell rings loudly. Alan and Lauren arrive wearing matching nautical outfits. They also bring their young daughter and her nanny. Brian playfully mocks their incredibly extravagant sailing gear. Alan embarrassingly admits the matching outfits were his idea. While waiting, Brian offers the guests a house tour. He proudly shows off Dylan inside a small dojo. Brian relentlessly encourages Alan to grapple with the boy. Alan hesitates but eventually steps onto the practice mat. To his utter shock, Dylan violently flips him over. Alan groans in serious pain on the hard floor. Brian finally commands his young son to stop fighting.
Submission.
What'd he do?
No, I can't.
The couples engage in a fiercely competitive racket game outside, as Brian and Sarah bicker over whose turn it is. Brian swings aggressively, narrowly missing Sarah's head with his racket, ignoring Alan's requests for everyone to calm down and relax. The tension escalates as Brian screams in triumph after scoring, diving wildly across the court to keep the rally alive. Alan doubles over in intense pain and begins to retch, while Brian awkwardly brags about the speed of his shot. Sarah forces a reluctant Brian to offer a proper apology, but he instead taunts Alan about forfeiting the preschool spot. Retreating inside the darkened house, the group searches for Grace. Suddenly, a figure in a horrifying bug mask attacks them, revealing himself to be Brian's father playing a cruel prank. Disturbed by the weird environment, Alan promptly takes Grace home. The next morning, Brian rushes to deliver Dylan's preschool application, barging into Sylvia's office to ensure it gets read first. He notices Grace's application file and is completely taken aback, learning that Alan's daughter supposedly woke someone from a coma. Feeling outdone, Brian desperately tries to stall in the office, hoping to revise Dylan's letter with more impressive fake details. However, Sylvia dismisses him to attend a supposedly urgent meeting. Frustrated, Brian mutters about Alan using Photoshop to fake achievements. Meanwhile, Alan warmly greets Sylvia outside with a large umbrella. shielding the headmistress as they walk together through the rain. Brian secretly follows them through the streets to a restaurant and bursts inside to crash their private lunch meeting. He loudly interrupts them, pretending the encounter is a coincidence. Alan confidently explains he invited Sylvia to dine with him, revealing he just donated 30 new laptops to the preschool. Brian immediately mocks Alan for using Lauren's wealth for bribes. Alan tries to sound philosophical about investing in the children, but Brian quickly calls him out for quoting Whitney Houston. Unfazed, Alan continues to charm Sylvia while ignoring Brian's jabs, following a bitter argument over the rival father purchasing laptops. Brian furiously screams out his intense frustrations into the void. Speaking with his dad soon after, Brian refuses to quit. He remains determined to secure the highly coveted preschool slot. Disgusted by his wealthy rival's heavily groomed mustache and arrogance, Brian decides he needs a highly creative presentation to win. Later, an energetic television advertisement catches his full, undivided attention. A popular children's group announces a live broadcast for tomorrow. Arriving at the packed studio venue, Brian is unfortunately denied entry. Desperate, he begs a shady scalper to secure his admission. The scalper demands a hefty £200 in cash, which Brian immediately hands over to sneak inside the building. Once backstage, he intercepts the costumed performers in their room. Brian tries hiring the famous entertainers for the preschool event. However, the arrogant band rejects his earnest, small-scale proposal. They boast that they only perform on large television stages now. Brian mistakenly scrambles their official group name during his pitch. Ignoring his pleas, the eager band rushes out to perform. The loud studio audience cheers wildly as the show begins. Refusing to take no for an answer, Brian aggressively follows. He demands they reconsider his offer right on the stage. The performers completely ignore him as the live broadcast starts.
Costume. Don't touch me, you sorry.
During the chaotic performance, tensions quickly escalate behind the scenes. One costumed performer cruelly insults Brian's young child without hesitation. Enraged, Brian launches a violent physical attack against the entertainer. A massive brawl suddenly breaks out across the television studio. The entire physical altercation broadcasts completely live to horrified viewers. Families at home watch the unbelievable spectacle in sheer disbelief. Hours later, a miserable Brian paces inside a freezing jail cell. His brother Jeff eventually arrives to process the necessary bail. Brian immediately complains about the utterly terrifying night he endured. Jeff quickly mocks his brother's incredibly embarrassing, televised public assault. Once safely released, Brian places a deeply apologetic phone call. He sorrowfully admits his extreme actions were entirely misguided today. The story begins with Brian admitting his utter stupidity to Sarah over the phone, and he quickly apologizes for setting a terrible example. Sarah warmly wishes him luck on his upcoming presentation. Shortly after, Jeff ruthlessly criticizes Brian's childish clothing choice, and he warns that the car lacks enough charge. Brian ignores him and immediately exits the vehicle. Inside, the committee reluctantly grants him 3 minutes, and Brian profusely apologizes for his late tardiness. Sylvia calmly directs Brian straight to the wooden podium. He nervously admits he prepared absolutely nothing. But Sylvia asks how Pugsley helps Dylan. Brian explains that it provides missing opportunities. He fondly remembers being prepped for professional sports, but his teachers passed him without any real effort. Sadly, a broken ankle left him completely washed up, so Brian dug ditches for 5 long years.
I just don't want Dylan to make the same mistake. I did, but don't matter. Thank you.
After a devastating professional setback, Lauren gently comforts a defeated Alan, reminding him that they can overcome any challenge together. Meanwhile, Brian faces an absolute nightmare at his restaurant. When health inspectors shut the establishment down for weeks, the inspector cites an unprecedented and massive insect infestation, leaving a completely devastated Brian screaming in pure agony. He frantically explains to Sarah that Alan sabotaged him, convinced the man planted the bugs to ruin him. Brian completely loses his temper and plots his revenge. Shortly after, Brian arrives at Alan's home looking utterly deranged, carrying a heavy sledgehammer and terrifying everyone in sight. Alan notices Brian's face is absurdly swollen from insect bites, but the distraction fails to stop Brian's violent rampage. The two infuriated fathers violently clash in the yard, engaging in a brutal and completely unhinged physical brawl. They ruthlessly wrestle each other to the ground, panting heavily, while mercilessly trading agonizing blows and screaming in pure rage. The bitter rivals continue to grapple relentlessly without stopping, threatening to snap each other's limbs in sheer desperation. Suddenly, an exhausted Sarah furiously screams at them to stop. Alan complains that Brian destroyed a priceless family statue. But Sarah abruptly reveals she bought it at a garden center. Disgusted by their incredibly embarrassing and immature behavior, Sarah and Lauren abandon the bruised men to get drinks. Later, the battered fathers sit together inside an ambulance, where Alan finally confesses to planting the vicious spiders. They awkwardly insult each other's swollen faces and ruined clothes, assuming their wives are currently mocking their pathetic fight. However, Sarah and Lauren are actually sharing a heartfelt drink, bonding over how ridiculous their highly competitive husbands are acting. Back in the ambulance, Brian finally drops his aggressive guard, admitting he desperately wants Dylan to have Alan's wealthy lifestyle. Surprisingly, Alan completely praises Brian's impressive self-made business success, confessing that he constantly feels like a massive fraud himself. At the bar, Lauren emotionally details her past IVF struggles, explaining how little Grace was an absolute miracle for them. Alan mutually agrees that their daughters must forge their own paths, realizing both fathers simply want the best for their children. Lauren and Sarah mutually admit their shared anxiety over preschool, realizing they both deeply dread being separated from their kids. They promise to figure out their chaotic lives together, agreeing that infinite money cannot easily solve every family problem. Brian strangely admits to smelling Alan's drapes during a tense conversation, and Alan questions Brian's incredibly bizarre and invasive behavior. Later, an exhausted Alan is told that he looks absolutely terrible, but Lauren greets him cheerfully before they head toward the preschool. Alan and Sarah walk with Grace and Dylan toward the entrance, and inside the office, they sit down to speak with Sylvia. Sylvia regretfully informs the hopeful parents about the available preschool slot, as she admits that nepotism has ultimately claimed the final open position, and so the disappointed group forces polite laughter and accepts the news. Outside, Alan tries to gather Grace and Dylan to quickly leave, but panic suddenly sets in when they realize the children vanished. Fortunately, a nearby janitor claims the kids wandered off toward Julie. Searching the adjacent building, they find Julie guiding a playful activity, and the relieved parents express gratitude for her keeping them safe. Julie explains that fleeing children frequently arrive during Pugsley's registration season, and she suggests that the strict preschool is not right for everyone. And nearby, Dylan acts out a highly stressful and demanding academic routine, while he pretends that playing hide-and-seek is for dummies. Grace playfully agrees that she must put in the hard work, and the parents happily applaud their children's insightful and satirical performance. Julie emphasizes that pushing young kids too hard leads to burnout, and so Brian quickly asks what they must do to enroll there. Julie reveals they can simply sign up and drop them off. And Lauren cheerfully declares her desire to stay and play there. Sometime later, an officiant presides over a joyful internet-ordained wedding ceremony, and the happy couple is officially pronounced as husband and wife. A cheerful voice loudly celebrates the families finally joining together forever, and though another person immediately jokes that they are definitely not family, eventually, a children's television host excitedly addresses his young viewing audience. He playfully demonstrates how to properly put on a nappy alone, and while he carefully flaps the diaper over to secure it tight, he warns the kids to avoid getting their legs completely wet. And in celebrating his success, the host happily declares he is dressed. Cheerful music swells as a choir vocalizes into the end credits, and the uplifting musical score eventually fades out as the film concludes.